The war on drugs began in 1971, when then President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one. Nixon decided to increase funding for drug control agencies and drug treatment efforts. And in 1973, he created the DEA, also known as the Drug Enforcement Agency, whose primary goal was to combat drug-related crimes. The war on drugs resulted in a massive increase in incarceration rates, from 50,000 in the 1980s to over 400,000 by 1997. One of the many reasons for an increase in funding for the war on drugs during the 1980s was due to the fact that there was an increase in media coverage on the ongoing crack epidemic that was sweeping the nation. This resulted in public nervousness, which in turn heightened the concern on illicit drugs. By the late 1980s, a mass hysteria swept America about drugs, which led to the passage of the draconian penalties in Congress. This would result in state legislators rapidly increasing the prison population as a result of these penalties. During the mid-1980s, notable changes started to arise after the implementation of the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. One of those major changes was the large gap between the amount of crack and cocaine that resulted in the same or similar sentences. During the 1980s, approximately 80% of all crack users were African American, which resulted in an unequal increase of incarceration rates for nonviolent African American drug offenders. Many of these factors have fueled the idea that the war on drugs is more of a war on minorities instead of a war on drugs. This is primarily due to the fact that most white drug offenders got off with not as harsh sentences, while most African American and Latino offenders received harsher, or in some cases longer sentences than their white counterparts. The 1990s saw the arrival of a new era on the war on drugs. During Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign, he advocated for treatment instead of incarcerating drug offenders. However, by the time he got into the White House, he reverted back to strategies used by his Republican predecessors, which was escalating the war on drugs. Bill Clinton also famously signed a bill into action in 1993, the controversial Three Strikes Laws, which essentially made it to where mandatory life sentences are provided if a convicted felon has 2 or more previous convictions in state or federal court. After Bill Clinton's presidency, we saw the era when George W. Bush arrived in office. It was also the era in which George Bush put into effect the rapid militarization of domestic drug law enforcement. The drug war has impacted a wide variety of people, but more so, those who have been deported or sentenced to life in prison, all for a simple marijuana possession. It has been reported that more than 250,000 people have been deported from the U.S. for drug law violations every year since 2007. This is extremely upsetting due to the fact that marijuana reform is on the rise, and on top of all of this, many politicians have admitted to using marijuana and even cocaine in some instances. One example of this is former President Barack Obama, who when asked in an interview if he had tried marijuana before, responded with, "Yes, and I loved it."